Hello, 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 and welcome to Writer's Workshop. Good afternoon. I hope you had a great lunch. It's Mr. Taco. We're here. Happy Friday. Thank you for being here on a Friday afternoon. It's been a heck of a week, so I'm glad that you're here, and we get to talk a little bit about writing and a little bit about our upcoming fantasy narrative fiction short story that we're going to be working on. As always, here's the I can above my head right here. It says this: I can identify different elements necessary for an engaging narrative. And for this lesson, as you can see over there, we're really just going to sort of listen and start to get our creative juices flowing as far as what kind of a story and what our focus of our narrative fiction is going to be about. And then as soon as this is over, we've got an exit ticket on Google Classroom, and you can get started writing if you have an idea of what to write about. So let's get into it. This idea of the heart of the story. We talked about this in 4th grade as realistic narrative fiction. And in 5th grade, we're getting into the fantasy realm where there's magical elements, there's things that might happen in our story that can't happen in real life. However, that heart of the story needs to still remain. You can create a world, a fantasy world that is fully fleshed out and is beautiful and has lots of detail and has lots of really interesting components. But then if you have a story that's not very engaging or a main character that's not very interesting, no amount of fantastical magical details are going to help that story really be engaging. It's still got to be at its core a story that people want to read, a story that people want to identify with, and a story that people can learn something from. So first, let's look at our chart from last time when we were thinking about sort of some of the key differences between realistic fiction and fantasy fiction. So for realistic fiction, again, the rules of that world must happen in real life. It's something that we could theoretically see play out in front of our own eyes. Whereas fantasy fiction has any number of magical or time travel-y or futuristic elements involved. And as long as there are rules to your fantasy world, and it's not a case where anybody can do anything at any time, it's going to still feel like a story that's grounded in has some sort of grounding, some sort of foundation. If there aren't any rules to our fantasy world, it's hard for readers to, I talked about this last lesson, but to suspend their disbelief. Because if there's too many things happening and there's fantastical elements that aren't happening with any sort of pattern or rhyme or reason, then as a reader we go, well, I can't really engage with this because I don't know the rules of the world that I'm trying to imagine in. So you think about something like Harry Potter or Percy Jackson or Arusha or any of the great fantasy characters and fantasy worlds, all of those are still bound by some sort of rule. It's not a matter of, Snape or Voldemort or whoever can't just do anything, right? It's a spell that they've learned. It's something that they've worked on. There's a limit to what wizards in J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter world can and can't do, or should or shouldn't do. And then there's still the Muggle world that grounds it in reality, right? No matter whether you're in fantasy or realistic or in science fiction, which is kind of fantasy plus the explaining in the background and can tend to be more sort of robots and spacecraft and that kind of a thing, it's really at its heart about the journey, about the story itself, the plot events, what are happening in the story, and it's about these strong characters that are inhabiting that world and playing a role in getting our protagonist, our main character, our hero, from point A to point B. So let's take a look at some of the elements of a great story. I've got them up here. Really thinking about, again, this word protagonist, basically the fancy academic word for our main character. It starts there, of having a strong and fully realized protagonist. You think about Arusha as a main character. She's not just a seventh grader living in Atlanta in a museum of Indian history. She's got flaws. She's got strengths. She's a really great talker. She's got a lot of charm. She stretches the truth, I think is a nice way of saying it, meaning, she kind of lies to protect herself in a lot of ways. And having a character that's multifaceted, that has a lot of depth, really makes us want to continue reading to see how that depth can change. Are our main character's flaws going to be magnified by what happens in the story? Is there a situation where if our character has trouble being honest, are they going to be challenged by that later in the story? Or is that going to be a situation where maybe one of their flaws actually becomes a strength later in the story? But having a character that is multifaceted and feels like a real person, because none of us are perfect. We all have flaws. We all have strengths. And our characters, even in a fantasy story, have to match that idea of having some strengths and having some flaws. If a character was completely perfect and never did wrong, to be honest, it wouldn't be a very interesting character to read about, because what, are they just going to make the right decision every time and that's it, right? Stories are built around conflict, leading to the second point, a central conflict that drives the action. Stories are built around conflict. So if you have a character that's all good or all evil, there's not going to be a whole lot of conflict there because it's cut and dry. That is what it is, right? You want a character that lives in the gray. You want a character that has some times where you can empathize with them and sympathize with them, and you do want to shoot for a character that can make the readers a little bit frustrated at times. We're going, why did you make that decision? And seeing what happens, see what comes of those maybe misguided decisions in the plot. So you want a character with strengths and flaws. You want a character also that has wants and hopes, because often that's going to drive that central conflict as well. One of my favorite books is a book called Walk Two Moons by Sharon Creech. It's a realistic fiction story, but it's one of these going on a journey stories. And the main character really, it's a story about wanting to find family and wanting to know more about where you come from. And in our heart, I think we all kind of want to know more about where we come from and the roles that our ancestors played and the roles that others played in getting us to this point here in the year 2020 or in the year that your story is happening. And so having a character with wants and dreams is really important because that's, again, going to drive that action. Maybe they're overcoming an obstacle, taking one of their flaws and working through it, right? There's a lot of stories where, often in young adult or middle grade fiction, you'll see, a common trope, right, is like character starts a new middle school or starts a new, moves to a new town and has to make new friends and maybe they encounter a villain, right? Or it's a mystery story and they're searching for something missing. And that something missing doesn't have to be a tangible thing. It doesn't have to be, a lost necklace or a lost book or a lost diary. It can be a lost sense of purpose or a lost sense of self. Or it could be a lost person, right? Those mystery stories can exist in the fantasy realm, just like they can in the realistic realm as well. So we need to have a strong, fully realized protagonist. We've got to have a central conflict. And then we've got to have a story that builds to a lesson, a conclusion, a resolution. And that is why one thing we're going to look at, and our exit ticket looks at that, are some, what we call archetypes, some common story arcs that you'll see throughout literature that really give a basis for what kind of story you're going to write. And so having a story that builds to a lesson or a conclusion or a resolution kind of means before you even start writing the story, you have to have that lesson, conclusion, or resolution in mind. A great tactic for this is to come up with a timeline, come up with an arc for your story. Let's say, here's the beginning of our story. Here's the end of our story. And we might think about this beginning to end, and we really might want to think about this idea that it's kind of like an arc when we're tracking our action throughout. Our story might start with our character, starting in a new school, and then the first day is kind of a disaster, so our conflict is building. Maybe they meet the popular kids at school, so the conflict keeps building. Maybe they meet a new friend and have, a little moment of levity to just kind of meet somebody and feel new. There's conflict building. Maybe there's, whatever that climax of your story is, where the sort of the big thing happens. Could be like the, championship game of some tournament, or like a final project or a presentation, or it could be, the final battle with the bad guy and that kind of a thing. And then after that climax, when, often the good guy wins if you're writing a one-off story. Maybe if we're writing a series with multiple books, maybe the bad guy wins in one book. And you've got to tune into the next one to see what happens. And that's sort of a longer, more meta arc, right? And so thinking about and mapping out the different parts to your story, okay? You don't have to do it kind of like a mountain like this either. You could really just do it as a timeline. You could say, here's the beginning of our story. Here's the end of our story. And then here are all the things that happen along the way, right? If you know your character, I'll stick with kind of an Arusha-esque character because she's on my mind because I like that series, right? So maybe it's a character that is struggles with being honest, right? And so the checkpoints along the way might be those major events where that honesty is tested, right? Maybe, here our main character could get caught in a lie, which means here they've started the lie, lied about something major. Right? And then here might be, they look for forgiveness or they make amends. Or maybe they're put in a situation where they could lie again and they make a different choice. They choose honesty. And then by the end, because they've chosen honesty, they've grown a little bit and there has been a little bit of that journey. Right? If you don't plan this out ahead of time, or at least do a little bit of thinking about it, it can get into that situation where you're writing, and there's no conclusion, and you've written 12 pages, and you're no closer to a resolution than when you started, and now all of a sudden you have 2 days left to wrap up your story, and you don't know where it's going. So even if you're what's called a pantser, if you're someone that sort of writes by the seat of their pants and just makes decisions in the moment about what would their character would do next, still have an idea of what you want your character to experience, what lesson, what resolution is going to come at the end, so you have that checkpoint in mind and you know what you're writing toward. And you can have detours along the way, right? It doesn't have to go from lied about something to caught in a lie. You could have a sub-story in here where there's something completely different going on that is also engaging, to your reader. Maybe, not only that, but there's a fight or an argument or something, some other piece of conflict, some other secondary conflict in there that you could add. But at its heart, it's still building to that resolution. okay? So again, taking a look one more time, really making sure and thinking about our protagonist, our conflict, and having some sort of resolution. And you can do this in any sort of fantasy realm. And in fact, some story arcs fit really, really well with some fantasy genres. If we're thinking about sort of like the medieval knights and, knights and dragons and wizards and that kind of a thing, if you're writing a story in that realm, really thinking about what kinds of characters and what kinds of stories are really well meshed with working in a medieval setting versus like dystopia, right? Of, more of like our zombies in the future and survival and that kind of thing. That feels more like a journey, right? Versus our medieval story might be more about like overcoming a villain or like dethroning the evil king, or that, or like a rags to riches story of like the farmer that finds a magical helmet that makes him invincible or something. I'm just making this up off the top of my head, so these ideas aren't great, but this idea that what we're doing is we're taking what we did in fourth grade and thinking about what makes a great story, what makes the heart of a great story, and now we're adding that layer of fantasy that can enhance an already great story. Let me look at the chat, see if there's any questions. Ava says, what if we can't manage to wrap up the story at the end of the unit? Well, do some planning, and I bet you can wrap it up. And what does it say? Could you do a murder? Well, not in real life, obviously. That's a crime and is very, very bad, so don't. Could you write a story with a murder? You could. It can get kind of dark pretty quick. So that certainly is a conflict, and there are certainly lots of murder mysteries and stories that involve murder. I'm not going to say no. It wouldn't be what I'd choose to write about because you have to spend, 6 weeks in that world. But, we'll work on it in small group. What if the good guy doesn't win? The good guy doesn't have to win. Maybe that's the conclusion to this section of the story or this part of the story. Maybe that, because you think about real life stories, good guys don't win all the time. They, sometimes the bad guy gets away with it. And that can be a part of the resolution, is maybe the bad guy does get away with it, but the protagonist has learned from this experience and is better equipped to eventually topple the bad guy in the sequel. Or often what happens in a lot of, kind of like superhero crime fighter stories is there's like a mega at the top bad guy, and then there's like little sub bad guys. So maybe like, one of the bad guys gets resolved in this story, but the super mega baddie is still out there, right? That sets up a sequel and a series. Let's see, any other things in the chat? Nope, I think that's it. All right, everybody, thank you for tuning in. I appreciate it. Do the exit ticket. If you get done with the exit ticket and you have an idea of what you want to write about, go ahead and start writing. We're going to start working in small groups and looking at our writing next week. So if you have something to work on already, you're a little bit ahead of the game, and that's great. And if you still aren't sure of what you want to write about, that's fine too. You've got plenty of time to think about it before we really start to get something on paper. All right. One more really good question from Cole. Can I write from a bad guy's perspective? Absolutely. Your protagonist can be, either thought of as an anti-hero or really from a bad guy's perspective, right? There's a whole series. It's a whole series called The Bad Guys, right? Written from that bad guy perspective where, they don't think they're the bad guys and they've gotten a bad rap. There's other stories. I'm just thinking of movies like, Despicable Me. Gru starts as a bad guy, and then eventually it turns out that he's not as bad as we thought at the beginning of the movie. That's a great arc too. Okay? So lots to think about, lots to do, and we've got lots of time to do it. So thanks for tuning in. Writing Group D, we will see you in the Zoom room in about 10 minutes or so. Everybody else, good luck on the exit ticket. Good luck in Makerspace. We'll see you for closing meeting at 2:15. Cheers.